.NET Core is a new and shiny technology, the next generation of Microsoft's premier development framework. It has some very enticing features, and I suspect that most of us developers will be using it extensively within a few years. But should you move to .NET Core today? At the moment, that's a tough question, and I anticipate that it will remain tough for a year or more, long after its initial release. There are a lot of things to consider, not least of which is that the technology is not really yet done. There are a lot of necessary features that remain to be implemented, and I'm particularly talking about ASP.NET Core when I say things like that. So basically, there are times when .NET Core is appropriate and when it's not, and when using the full .NET framework is appropriate and when it's not. So let's dig into some of those issues. I've assembled some of the most compelling and important reasons why you would care and want to use the .NET Core platform now. First, of course, is that it's cross-platform. Clearly, if your goal is to have an application that needs to run across platforms, at least Windows, Linux, and Mac OS, the only choice is to use .NET Core, as its runtime and libraries are cross-platform. Of course, you could always use the Mono project as well. Both choices are open source, but .NET Core is directly and officially supported by Microsoft, and it's going to have a heavy investment moving forward in both the near and the long-term future. When using .NET Core across platforms, the best development experience exists on Windows with the Visual Studio IDE, which supports many productivity features, all the usual stuff of Visual Studio. Things like project management, debugging, source control, refactoring, rich editing, including the ever-wonderful IntelliSense, testing, support for direct testing, and so forth. But rich development is also supported using Visual Studio Code on Mac, Linux, and Windows, including IntelliSense and debugging. Even third-party editors like Sublime, Emacs, Vi, and others work well and can get editor IntelliSense using the open-source OmniSharp project. Okay, another thing to consider is the performance and scalability. When your system needs the best possible performance and scalability, that's really where .NET Core and ASP.NET Core shine. The more you can do with the same amount of infrastructure or hardware or whatever resources that the application consumes, the richer the experience that you're going to have for your end users, and generally at a lower cost. You can also have side-by-side .NET versions at the application level. If you want to be able to install applications with dependencies on different versions of frameworks in .NET, you need to use .NET Core, which lets you run them side by side. Another thing to consider is microservices. When you're building a microservices-oriented system composed of multiple independent, dynamically scalable, stateful or stateless kinds of services, the advantage that you have with .NET Core is that you can use different technologies or frameworks or languages at the service level. That allows you to use the best approach and technology for each area in your system. It really does make a compelling case for distributed kinds of applications. So if you want to build very performant and scalable services, you might want to consider using .NET Core. Eventually, if you need to use any .NET framework library that's not compatible with .NET Core, there's really no issue because you can build that service with the .NET framework, and in the future you might be able to substitute it with .NET Core. In fact, that's a credible migration strategy going forward. And then you can also build the Windows 10 UWP .NET applications. And for me as a web developer, probably the most compelling thing is that ASP.NET MVC is even better than in classic ASP.NET. All that said, there are some reasons not to use .NET Core today. It's not appropriate for all situations today. It may be in a year, 2 years, 3 years, just depending on what you need for your application. But there are many situations where you still might not want to use .NET Core. If you have existing .NET framework applications, for the most part, you don't need to migrate your current .NET applications like ASP.NET in order to run on .NET Core. Not just because of the cost of the migration and rewriting the code would be significant, but also because as of today, you'll find that many of the third-party libraries that you're executing from .NET Framework code cannot be used from an app running in .NET Core. And as I mentioned earlier, that's changing fast though. However, If you want to start taking advantage of the new capabilities provided by ASP.NET Core, you can still migrate to ASP.NET Core, but keep running on the traditional CLR from the .NET framework. And that would allow you to reuse legacy third-party .NET libraries that aren't compatible with .NET Core, while taking advantage of new web capabilities and approaches in ASP.NET Core. Just proceed carefully with that scenario. If you're developing a large enterprise application that can't be loosely coupled and composed by isolated components or services, chances are that as soon as you need to consume libraries that are compatible only with the .NET framework, if you're using the .NET Core runtime, it'll be a showstopper, as those components or libraries that you need can't run on the .NET Core runtime. A feasible approach here would be to use ASP.NET Core, but run it on top of the .NET framework. Again, another situation where that might work. So you can consume any .NET library from the framework or third party. And then again, in the future, you could eliminate those dependencies. But just keep in mind that refactoring with a monolithic architecture won't be as easy as if it had been loosely coupled from the start. Another situation is if you need full capabilities of higher level frameworks, such as Entity Framework 6.x, WCF, Windows Workflow, and so forth. Even though .NET Core has several new libraries, such as Entity Framework Core, and others are coming, in .NET Core, at least the initial release, they don't have all the functionality of their peers in the .NET framework. They're there to make porting code easier for developers who need the capabilities provided by .NET Core. In fact, if you need libraries or functionality that are still not supported by .NET Core, one recommended approach is to create a decoupled microservices or services using the full .NET framework that eventually could be migrated to .NET Core. So you get additional performance and scalability benefits in the future. Okay, so I've mentioned that option several times. And then another issue is that if you need sub-frameworks that aren't supported by .NET Core, if you need to use things like WPF, Web Forms, or WinForms, or other frameworks that are not supported by .NET Core, then you still need to use the full .NET framework. Microsoft's being pretty transparent about what frameworks it's going to port to .NET Core, although they are making commitments about making them open source. Mainly, they're capturing the desire. What the community expresses is the frameworks that they want to work with .NET Core. That being said, if you care about any specific components moving to .NET Core, consider participating in the discussions on GitHub so that your voice can be heard. Okay, at the risk of beating a dead dust bunny, let me approach this from one more angle. There are plenty of reasons why you'll want to stay with the full .NET framework, particularly if you have a large code base built on it. First and foremost, because you need features missing from .NET Core. And this is probably the primary reason for sticking with the .NET framework. And today there are a lot of features missing, some of which Microsoft is unlikely to ever bring to .NET Core. One is ASP.NET Web Form applications. Way back in the day, this was a bridge technology that helped a lot of Windows desktop developers make the jump to web application development. But it's an archaic technology that provides far too thick an abstraction over how the web works today. But if you're heavily invested in web forms, stick with the full .NET framework. Web forms will be there for a very long time to come. Another is Windows desktop applications, such as WPF, which is Windows Presentation Foundation applications. WPF is only supported and provided by the full .NET framework, so you can't use .NET Core for it. Similarly, Windows Forms applications. WinForms is only provided by the full .NET framework. And to my knowledge, Microsoft has no plans to bring these to .NET Core. In fact, I suspect this is one of the strong reasons why we can be confident that the full .NET framework will be alive and well for many years to come. There are just huge code bases of all kinds of application types that rely on those technologies. So Microsoft just isn't going to pull the plug on those, I hope. Another is Windows Workflow Foundation and Services. To my knowledge, Microsoft has no intention of bringing these into .NET Core. Also, WCF Data Services, which were formerly known as ADO.NET Data Services. No sign that Microsoft are going to move these to .NET Core. And Visual Basic. Kind of pains me to say this, but VB is not today supported in .NET Core. Microsoft promises that it's coming, but this is probably yet another blow to the language, I'm sorry to say. I was first awarded an MVP so very long ago in Visual Basic, and although I use C# exclusively today in the .NET world, VB will always have a place in my heart. And finally, another issue is if you need third-party libraries or NuGet packages that don't support .NET Core. This could be kind of a mixed bag. Depending on the component, you might be able to get away with using them in a .NET Core application running in the full .NET framework. But in many cases, you probably can't. It really kind of depends on what the package does and what it's all about. Presumably, over time, these will migrate to .NET Core, at least the products that are active and widely used, but no guarantees. And there are other features missing today that are in the short-term roadmap for .NET Core, things like ASP.NET Web Pages and SignalR.